Good evening, and as the world quiets around you, let us drift back, not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of years, into a land that does not yet know its own name. Before there was China, before there were emperors, before even the idea of civilization, there was only land, wind, and survival in the vast stretches of East Asia, long before memory. Early human ancestors moved across open plains and forest edges. These were not people as we know them, but Homo erectus, beings who walked upright, who shaped stone into tools, and who learned slowly, painfully, how to endure. Near what is now Zacudian, traces of their lives still remain. Charred bones, fragments of skulls, and the faint signs of controlled fire whisper across hundreds of thousands of years. Fire, fragile, dangerous, miraculous, meant warmth against brutal winters, protection from predators, and the first fragile control over a hostile world. Life here was unforgiving. Cold winds swept across the northern plains. Food was uncertain. Survival was never guaranteed beyond the next few days. And yet, they endured. Time passed in vast, silent ages. Ice sheets crept and retreated. Climates shifted. Landscapes transformed. And slowly, almost invisibly, something changed at BY around 10,000 BC. The Great Ice Age loosened its grip. Warmer air settled over the land. Rivers swelled with new life. Among them, two would come to define everything that followed: the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. These rivers were not gentle. They flooded without warning, reshaping the land, destroying anything in their path. But when the waters receded, they left behind something extraordinary: rich, fertile soil. And for the first time, humans did something that would change history forever. They stayed. Instead of wandering endlessly in search of food, small groups began to settle along these riverbanks. At first, it was tentative, temporary shelters of wood and grass, camps that could be abandoned at a moment's notice. But then came a discovery so simple, yet so powerful, it reshaped the future. Seeds could be planted. Wild grains, especially millet in the north, began to be gathered, scattered, and eventually cultivated. It was not immediate mastery. Crops failed. Floods destroyed early efforts. Hunger remained constant. But slowly, through repetition and memory, knowledge grew. Families began to return to the same places year after year. They built slightly stronger shelters. They stored food for winter. They watched the seasons, learning patterns, when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for hardship. This was the birth of agriculture, and with it the birth of a new way of life. Days were no longer dictated by the hunt alone, but by cycles. The rhythm of planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting before the cold returned. Life became rooted, not just in land, but in time itself. Yet survival was still fragile. Floods from the Yellow River could erase entire settlements overnight. Disease spread easily. Injuries that today would be minor could mean death. Children did not always survive. Few lived long lives. If you were to step into that world, even for a single night, the cold, the darkness, the uncertainty, it would feel overwhelming. And yet for them, this was normal. BY around 7,000 BCE, something remarkable had begun to take shape. Villages. Not large, not yet complex, but real. Groups of families living together, sharing labor, sharing risk. In the north, people ground millet into flour using stone tools. They stored it in clay containers, crude at first, but effective. And then, unexpectedly, something else appeared. Art. Pottery began to carry patterns, simple at first, then more deliberate. Red surfaces marked with black designs. Swirls, lines, shapes that had no direct survival function. These are not tools. They were expressions that a sign that the human mind was no longer focused only on survival, but on meaning. Far to the south, along the humid stretches of the Yangtze, a different path was unfolding. Here, the land was wetter, richer, more unpredictable in its own way. And here another discovery emerged. Rice. Unlike millet, rice demanded more. It required water control, patience, coordination. Fields had to be flooded deliberately. Seedlings transplanted carefully. It was harder work, but the reward was greater. And so, two worlds began to form at in the north. Hardy millet farmers shaped by dry winds and unpredictable floods at in the south. Rice cultivators mastering water and wetlands. These differences would echo for thousands of years, shaping culture, diet, and identity across what would one day become China. Back in the villages, life slowly deepened. Dogs and pigs were domesticated, living alongside humans as both companions and resources. Tools improved, polished stone axes, sharper blades, more efficient methods of cutting wood and harvesting crops. Homes became more stable. In the north, many were built partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation against the cold. In the south, houses rose on wooden stilts above damp ground, protecting against floods and insects. Inside, daily life unfolded in small, repetitive acts, grinding grain, tending fires, repairing tools, watching the sky. But beneath these simple routines, something profound was growing. Memory. For the first time, people were not just surviving, they were remembering. The land was no longer just a place to pass through. It became a place tied to identity, to ancestors, to something deeper, and nowhere is this more visible than in how they treated their dead. Unlike earlier times where bodies might be abandoned, these communities began to bury their dead with care. They placed tools beside them, pots filled with food, ornaments of bone or early jade. Sometimes, infants were buried beneath the floors of homes, as if to keep them close, still part of the family. This was more than ritual. That it was the beginning of a belief that the dead were not truly gone, that they remained, watching, influencing, existing in a world just beyond sight. This quiet idea, born in small villages of mud and thatch, would one day become one of the most powerful forces in Chinese civilization, ancestor reverence. And still, the rivers flowed. Unpredictable, destructive, life-giving. The Yellow River, especially, became both feared and depended upon. It could wipe away years of labor in a single flood. Yet without it, the land would turn barren. This duality, creation and destruction, balance and chaos, etched itself into the mindset of these early people. They learned something essential. You do not conquer nature. You live with it. You adapt, endure, rebuild. And in that quiet understanding, in those fragile villages along restless rivers, the first true foundations were laid, not of a nation, but of a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. As these early villages settled into the rhythm of seasons, something subtle but powerful began to change. Life was no longer only about survival. It was beginning to organize itself. Across the fertile plains of the Yellow River, small farming communities expanded. What had once been scattered huts slowly grew into structured villages, where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people lived side by side. Paths formed between homes. Shared spaces appeared. Storage pits were dug deeper, holding surplus grain that could carry a community through harsh winters or failed harvests. And with surplus came something new: stability. For the first time, not everyone needed to spend every waking moment searching for food. Some individuals could focus on other tasks. Pottery became more refined. Tools became more specialized. Skills began to separate one person from another. This was the quiet beginning of division of labor. Among the most influential of these early cultures was the Yangzhou culture, flourishing around 5000 BCE across the Central Plains. Their villages reveal a world that feels both distant and strangely familiar. Homes were often built partially underground, circular or square, with wooden beams supporting roofs layered in straw and earth. In the center of many homes, a hearth burned constantly, its smoke rising slowly through the roof, its warmth essential for survival. Around these homes, life moved with quiet purpose. Women and men worked the fields, planting millet, tending crops, harvesting what they could before the cold returned. Others shaped clay into vessels, spinning them by hand, firing them in simple kills. The results were not merely functional, they were beautiful. Painted pottery from Yangzhou sites carries bold designs, spirals, fish, geometric forms. These were not random decorations. They reflect a growing symbolic awareness, a human need to represent the world, to impose pattern onto chaos. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from Banpo, a Yangshao village frozen in time. Over 100 homes arranged around a central space suggest a community that valued cooperation. Storage pits held shared grain. Workshops produced tools. Life here was collective, interdependent. And interestingly, the graves at Banpo tell a deeper story. Some burials, especially those of women, contain more elaborate goods than others. This has led many historians to believe that early Yangshao society may have been more balanced in gender roles, possibly even tracing lineage through maternal lines. That it was not yet a world dominated by kings, that it was still a world of communities. But change was already underway. Far to the south, along the wetlands of the Yangtze River, another culture was rising, the Hemudu culture. Here, the environment shaped everything differently. The land was wet, humid, alive with insects and thick vegetation. Instead of digging into the ground, people built their homes on wooden stilts, lifting them above floodwaters and damp earth. Rice fields stretched outward, carefully managed, requiring coordination and effort. Water had to be controlled. Timing had to be precise. Farming here was not just labor, it was planning. And with planning came structure. Hemudu communities crafted wooden tools, wove cloth from plant fibers, and produced sturdy, darker pottery. Evidence of drums, carvings, and ritual objects suggests something even deeper, a spiritual life closely tied to nature. The forests, the rivers, the animals, these were not separate from human existence. They were part of a shared world, filled with unseen forces. Across both north and south, a pattern was emerging. Humans were no longer just reacting to nature. They were organizing within it around 3000 BCE. This transformation accelerated with the rise of the Longshan culture. And here, the tone shifts. Longshan pottery is striking, thin, black, almost polished to a mirror-like surface. It required skill, precision, and advanced kills. This was no longer simple village craft. It was specialized production, and the villages themselves had changed. Many Longshan settlements were surrounded by rammed earth walls, massive defensive structures built by compacting layers of soil. These were not symbolic. They were necessary, because now there was conflict. Resources, land, water, food were no longer abundant for everyone. As populations grew, so did competition. Communities began to defend themselves, to organize labor not just for farming, but for protection. Weapons appear more frequently in the archaeological record. Fortifications grow stronger, and within the graves, something even more telling emerges: inequality. Some individuals were buried with fine pottery, jade ornaments, and valuable goods. Others had almost nothing. This was new. For thousands of years, early communities had been relatively equal. But now, differences in wealth and status were becoming visible. Leaders were emerging, not just elders or respected figures, but individuals with authority. People who could organize labor, direct construction, command defense. The shift from community to hierarchy had begun, and still, the rivers remained at the center of everything. The Yellow River, especially, continued to flood unpredictably. Entire settlements could vanish in a single disaster. Yet each time, people returned, rebuilding, adapting, refusing to abandon the land that sustained them. This constant cycle, destruction followed by renewal, shaped more than survival. T-shaped thought. It planted the earliest seeds of ideas that would later define Chinese philosophy. The need for balance, the understanding that opposites coexist, that strength lies not in resisting change, but in adapting to it. Though these people had no written language yet, no formal philosophy, they were already living its principles. And alongside this, something else was forming: stories, oral traditions passed from generation to generation. Tales of leaders who guided their people, who brought order to chaos, who controlled floods and ensured survival. Among these figures, names begin to echo faintly through time: Yao, Shun, and most importantly, Yu the Great. Whether they truly lived as described is uncertain, but that almost doesn't matter, because what they represented was clear. A ruler was not just powerful, that a ruler had to bring order, had to protect the people, not from enemies alone, but from nature itself. These ideas, born in a world of fragile villages and unpredictable rivers, would later define what it meant to rule all of China, around 2000 BCE. The transformation was undeniable. What had once been scattered groups of farmers had become interconnected cultures. Villages had turned into proto-towns. Craft, trade, and hierarchy had taken root. Agriculture sustained life. Ritual gave it meaning. Leadership began to shape its direction. The world was no longer just human against nature. IT was becoming human organizing human. And standing at the edge of this transformation, something new was about to emerge. Not just culture, not just society, but the very first idea of a dynasty, that a ruling order that would claim not only land, but history itself, that villages turned into fortified towns and leadership hardened into authority. The world along the Yellow River entered something entirely new. Not just organized society, but the earliest form of state. And with that transformation, memory itself began to change, and no longer just stories of survival. The past became something larger, structured, meaningful, almost sacred. Generations looked backward and asked a new question: where did order come from? The answer they gave would shape thousands of years of history. They spoke of a dynasty, the first, the Xia dynasty. But this is where the story becomes uncertain, because the Xia exists in a space between legend and reality, where archaeology and memory overlap, but do not perfectly align. Later historians, especially the great Sima Qian, would describe the Xia as the beginning of Chinese civilization proper, a line of kings ruling from around 2100 to 1600 BCE, a dynasty that transformed scattered cultures into a unified realm. Yet, unlike later dynasties, the Xia left no written records of its own. Everything we know comes from those who lived long after it had passed. And still, the story persists, because it carries something deeper than simple fact. IT carries meaning. At the center of that meaning stands a figure who feels almost larger than life. Yu the Great, the land, as always, was at the mercy of water. The Yellow River flooded relentlessly, swallowing fields, destroying homes, drowning entire communities. Generations had tried to stop it, building barriers, blocking its flow, but nothing held. But you did something different. Instead of trying to fight the river, he worked with it. He organized massive efforts to dig channels, carve pathways through the land, redirect the floodwaters into safer routes. Not stopping nature, but guiding it. For years, some say decades, he labored alongside the people. The stories say he passed his own home 3 times without entering. So committed was he to the task. And in the end, the floods were controlled. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. True leadership was not domination, that IT was harmony. This idea would echo through all of Chinese history. The belief that a ruler must align human order with the forces of nature. And for this, Yu is remembered not just as a hero, but as the founder of a dynasty, the Xia. Now, beyond the legend, archaeology gives us something more tangible. In Hunan province, at a site known as Erlitu, remains of a complex society have been uncovered, dating roughly between 1900 and 1500 BC. Here, we find something unmistakable: large palatial structures, planned roads, workshops dedicated to bronze casting, evidence of centralized control. This was no longer a village. This was a city. Bronze, in particular, marks a turning point. Unlike stone, bronze required coordination, mining copper and tin, transporting materials, controlling high temperatures, and shaping complex forms. IT demanded organization, authority, power. The objects created, axes, tools, ritual vessels, were not just practical. Many were ceremonial, tied to belief systems that connected the living with the ancestors. And that connection was becoming central to everything that in these early states. Power was not just political, It was spiritual. Rulers did not simply command armies or manage resources. They performed rituals, honored ancestors, and maintained what people believed to be a balance between heaven, earth, and humanity, that if crops failed, if floods came, if disaster struck, it was not seen as random. It meant something was wrong. And that responsibility fell on the ruler. This is the beginning of a crucial idea. Authority must be justified. Even if the Xia dynasty itself remains partly unproven as a continuous political entity, what it represents is undeniable. That it marks the moment when leadership became kingship, when society accepted hierarchy not just as practical, but as necessary, when power was tied to moral responsibility. Life during this period, as reconstructed from sites like Erlitou, was both familiar and transformed. Farmers still grew millet in the north, using improved tools. Domesticated animals, pigs, cattle, sheep, provided food and labor. Villages fed into larger centers, creating networks of dependency and exchange. But now, above the farmers and craftsmen, there was an elite. Rulers lived in larger compounds. They controlled resources. They directed labor, building structures, organizing production, shaping the world around them. And beneath them, society became layered. Not everyone lived the same life anymore. Some are buried with jade ornaments, bronze vessels, symbols of status and power. Others were buried with little or nothing. Hierarchy was no longer emerging. It was established. And alongside this, rituals deepened. Bronze vessels were used in ceremonies honoring ancestors. Offerings were made, not just out of respect, but out of necessity. The living depended on the favor of those who had come before. The idea that ancestors could influence fortune, bring prosperity or disaster, became embedded in daily life. This belief would endure for millennia. But as powerful as the Xia story is, it is important to understand what it truly represents, that it is not just a historical claim, that it is a foundation myth. Like the early legends of Mesopotamia or ancient Greece, the Xia gives China a beginning, a sense that its civilization did not emerge randomly, but through a line of order, leadership, and continuity. And this continuity would become one of the defining features of Chinese identity. Dynasties would rise and fall. Wars would come and go. But the idea of an unbroken chain, from the earliest rulers to the present, would remain. Around 1600 BCE, the world had changed completely. What began as small farming communities had evolved into organized states. Bronze technology spread. Ritual systems deepened. Authority centralized. And somewhere within this transformation, whether fully historical or partly remembered, the Xia gave way to something new, something clearer, something undeniable. Because the next dynasty would not live in legend, it would carve its voice in a bone. It would leave behind inscriptions, objects, and records that speak directly across thousands of years. The age of myth was fading. The age of recorded history was about to begin. As the memory of the Xia dynasty fades into the uncertain distance between legend and archaeology, the story steps onto firmer ground, into a world that can finally speak for itself. Around 1600 BCE, a new power rises in the heart of the Yellow River Valley, the Shang Dynasty. And with the Shang, something extraordinary happens for the first time in this long story. The past begins to record itself. And no longer are we relying only on later retellings or buried traces in the earth. Now, the people of this world leave behind direct evidence of their thoughts, their fears, their decisions. Etched in a bone and preserved for over 3,000 years, Kati, the center of Shang power, lay a network of cities, each tied to a king who ruled not just as a political leader, but as something far more profound, a bridge between worlds. The most famous of these cities was Anyang, where the late Shang dynasty reached its height. Here, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of palaces, workshops, and vast royal tombs that reveal a society already complex, already deeply structured. The Shang world was built on hierarchy. At the top stood the king, absolute in authority, yet burdened with a responsibility unlike any ruler before him. He was not just a commander of armies or a ruler of land. He was the chief communicator with the ancestors, because in the Shang worldview, the dead were not gone. They were powerful. They watched, judged, influenced. And above even them stood a supreme force, often referred to as Shangdi, a distant, commanding presence governing fate itself. To navigate this invisible world, the Shang developed one of the most fascinating practices in human history, divination. Through what we now call oracle bones, the Shang kings sought answers to every uncertainty. These were typically the shoulder blades of oxen or the shells of turtles. Onto their surfaces, questions were carefully carved. Questions about harvests, war, weather, illness, childbirth, and the fate of the kingdom itself. The bone was then heated until it cracked, and in those cracks, meaning was found. But what makes this extraordinary is not just the ritual. It is what came next. The questions and often the outcomes were inscribed. And those inscriptions became the earliest known form of Chinese writing. Through them, we hear voices from 3,000 years ago that we see a king, asking whether rain will come, whether a military campaign will succeed, whether a royal consort will survive childbirth, whether the ancestors approve of a sacrifice. This was a world where nothing important was decided without consulting the unseen, and this belief shaped everything. Ritual was not optional to it was survival. The Shang kings conducted elaborate ceremonies, offering food, wine, animals, and at times, even human lives, to honor ancestors and secure their favor. These rituals were not symbolic gestures. They were seen as essential negotiations with forces that controlled reality itself. And at the center of these ceremonies stood one of the greatest achievements of the Shang: bronze. Shang bronze casting was unlike anything before it. Massive vessels, intricately designed, covered in patterns. Most famously the Tao Tai, a stylized, almost haunting animal face that seems to stare back from the metal. These vessels were not everyday objects. They were sacred, used in rituals, buried in tombs, symbols of power and connection to the divine. To produce them required immense organization, mining, transport, skilled labor, and centralized control. Bronze was not just a material. It was authority made visible. And nowhere is this more evident than in the tombs of Tianyang. Royal graves have been uncovered containing hundreds of bronze objects, jade ornaments, weapons, chariots, and the remains of sacrificed humans and animals. These were not just burials. They were entire worlds prepared for the afterlife. Kings did not go alone. They took their court with them. Servants, warriors, sometimes prisoners, all buried to continue serving beyond death. This reveals something stark and undeniable. Shang society was deeply unequal to the top. Kings and nobles lived in power and ritual importance. Beneath them were artisans and farmers, sustaining the system through labor. And at the bottom were slaves, often captured in war, whose lives could be taken as offerings. War itself was constant. The Shang did not exist in isolation. They fought neighboring groups, expanded their influence, and defended their territory. Their armies were equipped with bronze weapons, axes, spearheads, blades, that gave them a clear advantage over less advanced rivals. And then there were chariots. Introduced from the steppe regions, chariots became symbols of elite warfare. Fast, powerful, and intimidating, they carried noble warriors into battle, changing how war was fought and how power was displayed. But the Shang world was not only defined by kings. There were figures within it who stand out even now. None more remarkable than Fu Hao. She was not only a royal consort, but also a military leader and high priestess. Oracle bone inscriptions record her leading campaigns, commanding troops, and conducting rituals. Her tomb, discovered intact, contained weapons, bronzes, and treasures that speak to her extraordinary status. In a world often assumed to be dominated entirely by men, Fu Hao stands as powerful evidence of complexity, of roles that do not fit simple expectations. Daily life for ordinary people, however, remained tied to the land. Farmers cultivated millet, wheat, and barley. Rice, though more common in the south, was known and used. Animals were raised, pigs, cattle, sheep, supplementing diets, and providing labor. Craftsmen worked in specialized roles, shaping jade, carving bone, casting bronze. Skills passed through generations, refined over time. And all of it, every harvest, every hunt, every decision, existed under the shadow of belief. If the ancestors were pleased, life continued. If they were not, disaster would follow. This constant awareness created a world where the spiritual and the practical were inseparable. The king's authority rested not only on military strength, but on his ability to interpret and maintain harmony with this unseen realm. But no system, no matter how powerful, remains unchallenged forever. Why the later centuries of the Shang dynasty. Cracks began to appear. The cost of constant warfare, the burden of large-scale rituals, and the growing independence of regional powers all began to strain the system. The king's authority, once unquestioned, faced increasing pressure, and beyond the Shang heartland, in the west, another power was rising out of people who had once been subordinate, who had observed, learned, and grown stronger. They would not reject the Shang world. They would inherit it, transform it, and justify their rise with an idea that would echo across more than 2,000 years of history. An idea that power itself could be judged, that rulers could lose the right to rule, that heaven itself could turn against a king. The Shang did not yet fully understand it, but their time was coming to an end, and from their fall, a new vision of order would emerge, one that would define the rhythm of Chinese history for centuries to come. As the power of the Shang dynasty reached its height, it also moved quietly toward its breaking point, not in a single moment, but through a slow accumulation of pressure, strain, and imbalance that could no longer be sustained. The kings still ruled from their centers like Anyang, still performed rituals, still cast bronze vessels, and consulted oracle bones. But beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. The system that once held everything together, ritual, warfare, tribute, and belief, was becoming heavier, more demanding, and less stable. The later Shang rulers, especially the last king, often remembered as King Zhou, are described in later accounts as indulgent, excessive, and distant from the needs of the people. Whether every detail of these stories is true or shaped by later victors, the pattern they describe is familiar in history, a ruling power that begins to lose balance. The rituals grew more elaborate, the demands on labor increased, and the constant need for warfare and sacrifice drained both resources and loyalty. For the people working the land, life did not become easier with the rise of power above them. It became heavier, but at the same time, beyond the Shang heartland, another force was rising quietly in the west, in the valley of the Wei River. These were the Zhou, a people who had once existed at the edges of Shang influence, learning from them, adapting their systems, and building strength over generations. They were not outsiders in the sense of being completely foreign. They shared cultural elements, rituals, and agricultural life, but they were also different, shaped by a more rugged landscape and a growing sense of identity. Under leaders like King Wen of Zhou and later his son King Wu of Zhou, the Zhou began to consolidate power. They formed alliances, gathered support from groups dissatisfied with Shang rule, and prepared for a confrontation that would reshape the entire course of Chinese history. That confrontation came at the Battle of Mai, around 1046 BCE. It was not just a clash of armies, but a turning point in how power itself would be understood. The Zhou forces, though not overwhelmingly larger, carried something the Shang no longer fully possessed: momentum, unity, and belief in their cause. Accounts tell of Shang soldiers defecting during the battle, of morale collapsing, of a system already weakened from within giving way under pressure. The Shang fell, but what came next is what truly matters, because the Zhou did not simply replace the Shang. They explained it. They looked at the fall of the Shang and gave it meaning, not as a random event, not just as a military victory, but as something deeper, something cosmic. They said the Shang had lost the favor of heaven, and that heaven had given it to them. This idea became known as the mandate of heaven, and it would shape Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. It was simple, yet powerful. A ruler did not govern merely because of birth or force, but because they held a moral right granted by a higher order. If they ruled wisely, justly, and in harmony with the world, they kept that right. If they became corrupt, oppressive, or negligent, they lost it. And when they lost it, it was not rebellion to overthrow them. It was correction. This idea changed everything. It gave legitimacy to the Zhou, not as usurpers, but as rightful successors. It preserved continuity because the Shang had not been wrong in their time, they had simply failed in the end. And it created a pattern that would repeat again and again throughout Chinese history. Rise, flourish, decline, and replacement. The Zhou rulers presented themselves as the sons of heaven, mediators between the human world and this larger cosmic order. They continued many Shang practices, bronze rituals, ancestor worship, and even aspects of writing, but they expanded the worldview. Heaven, Tian, was no longer just a distant force, but moral authority that judged rulers themselves. Politically, the Zhou faced a challenge the Shang had managed differently: how to control a vast and growing territory. Their solution was a system that seemed practical at first, but carried its own risks. Land was granted to relatives, allies, and loyal followers, creating a network of regional lords who governed their own areas while pledging loyalty to the Zhou king. This system, often described as feudal, allowed the Zhou to extend their influence far beyond what a single centralized authority could manage. For a time, it worked. The early period of Zhou rule, known as the Western Zhou, brought stability and expansion. The capital was established near Haojing, and from there, the kings presided over a realm that was both unified and distributed. Rituals continued to bind the elite together. Bronze inscriptions now recorded events, victories, and dedications, not just questions to ancestors, but statements meant to be remembered. Daily life continued much as before for most people. Farmers still worked the land, growing millet in the north, tending crops with tools that were gradually improving. Animals were raised, seasons were followed, and survival still depended on the same rhythms established thousands of years earlier. But above them, the structure had become more defined. Kings, lords, warriors, and officials formed a clear hierarchy, each level tied together by obligation, ritual, and belief. Yet within this system, the seeds of future conflict were already present. Those regional lords, granted land and authority, were not merely administrators. Over generations, they built their own power bases. They controlled armies, collected resources, and developed identities tied not just to the Zhou king, but to their own territories. Loyalty, once strong, began to stretch. The king remained the son of heaven. But distance, ambition, and time slowly weakened that connection. Still, in these early centuries, the Zhou world held together. Rituals reinforced order. The mandate of heaven gave meaning to power. The memory of the Shang served as both foundation and warning. China, though not yet unified in the way it would later become, had entered a new stage, a stage where history was no longer just lived, but interpreted, where power was no longer just taken, but justified, and where the idea of a cycle, of rise and fall under heaven's watch, had taken root so deeply that it would never truly disappear. But cycles, by their nature, do not stand still. And as the Zhou kings continued to rule, the balance they had created would begin to shift, slowly at first, then unmistakably, because the very system that gave them strength would one day divide them. And the age of unity would give way to an age of fragmentation. As the authority of the Zhou dynasty settled over the land, it carried with it a sense of order, a structure that seemed, at least for a time, stable and enduring. The king, as the son of heaven, stood at the center of this world, performing rituals, granting lands, and maintaining the delicate balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. But power, once distributed, rarely remains still. The system that had allowed the Zhou to expand, the granting of land to loyal lords, began, slowly and almost invisibly, to reshape the balance of authority. These regional rulers were no longer temporary stewards. Over generations, their lands became inherited domains. Their armies grew stronger. Their courts became more elaborate. Their identities shifted from servants of the king to rulers in their own right. At first, the change was subtle. The lords still came to the royal court. They still performed rituals. They still acknowledged the king's authority. But distance mattered. A lord ruling far from the capital had to make decisions quickly, defending borders, managing resources, negotiating alliances. Waiting for the king's command was not always possible, and so autonomy grew. Bronze inscriptions from this period begin to reflect it. Where earlier records emphasized the king's authority, later ones increasingly celebrated the achievements of local lords, their victories, their dedications, their lineage. It was a quiet shift, but a significant one that the center was weakening. Meanwhile, the world beyond the Zhou borders was not still. Groups to the north and west, often labeled in later texts as outsiders or barbarians, pressed against the edges of Zhou territory. These were not simple raids. They were constant pressures, testing defenses, forcing responses, stretching the capacity of both king and lords. Internally, tensions grew as well. Not all lords were equal. Some controlled vast fertile lands, commanding large armies and significant resources. Others ruled smaller, weaker territories, vulnerable to pressure or absorption. Alliances formed and dissolved. Rivalries deepened. What had once been a network of cooperation began to feel like a field of competition. And still, ritual held everything together. At least on the surface, ceremonies remained central to Zhou life. Offerings to ancestors, music played in bronze bells, formal gatherings at court. These were not empty traditions. They were the framework that maintained order. The concept of ritual propriety governed relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, lord and king. It defined behavior, expectation, and hierarchy. In war. 2. Ritual still played a role. Battles were not yet the chaotic, total conflicts of later centuries. There were rules, expectations of conduct, respect among noble warriors, formal declarations. Chariots carried elite fighters into battle, not just as weapons, but as symbols of status. But beneath these rituals, reality was shifting. Conflicts became more frequent. Raids turned into campaigns. Smaller states were absorbed by larger ones. The idea of unity under the Zhou king began to fade into something more symbolic than real. The breaking point came in 771 BC, in a moment that would echo across centuries. The Zhou capital at Haojing was attacked by a coalition of internal rebels and external forces. The king, King Yu of Zhou, was killed. The center had fallen. This was not just the death of a ruler. It marked the end of an era, the Western Zhou, and the beginning of something far more uncertain. The royal court fled eastward, establishing a new capital at Luoyang. The dynasty itself did not disappear, but it changed fundamentally. The kings still existed. They still performed rituals. They still claimed the mandate of heaven. But their power was now largely symbolic. Real authority lay elsewhere, in the hands of the regional lords who now operated with increasing independence. This new phase is known as the Eastern Zhou, and within it, the first major period unfolds. The spring and autumn period. Is a time defined not by unity, but by fragmentation. Across the land, dozens of states competed for influence. Some rose quickly, building power through military strength and political skill. Others disappeared, absorbed into stronger neighbors. Alliances formed not out of loyalty, but necessity. Trust became fragile. Strategy became essential. Yet even in this fragmentation, something remarkable was happening. The old order was breaking, but in its place, new ideas were beginning to form. The weakening of central authority forced rulers and thinkers alike to confront fundamental questions. What makes a state strong? What makes a ruler legitimate? How can order be restored in a world that is falling apart? These were not abstract questions. They were urgent, because the world they lived in was changing rapidly. Technology advanced. Iron tools began to spread, improving agriculture and increasing production. Populations grew. Cities expanded, surrounded by walls, filled with markets, workshops, and administrative centers. The rigid aristocratic structure of earlier times began to shift as new classes. Merchants, skilled craftsmen, professional soldiers gained influence. Power was no longer defined solely by birth that IT could be built. And in this environment of constant change and uncertainty, certain states began to stand out, stronger, more organized, more ambitious. They did not claim the throne, but they acted as protectors of order, forming alliances and leading coalitions. These leaders became known as hegemons, dominant lords who, while still acknowledging the Zhou king, effectively held real power over other states. They fought wars, negotiated peace, and shaped the political landscape in ways the king no longer could. The Zhou world had not collapsed, but it had transformed. That IT was no longer a unified system guided by a central authority. That IT was a network of competing powers, each seeking survival, dominance, or stability in a world that no longer guaranteed any of them. And yet, even as conflict increased, the idea of the mandate of heaven remained, and no ruler openly rejected it. Instead, each sought to prove that they, in their own way, upheld order better than others. The belief endured. Even as the structure it once supported fractured, this tension between chaos and order, fragmentation and unity, would define the centuries to come. And from within this tension, something extraordinary would emerge. Not just new states, but new ways of thinking. Voices that would attempt to answer the chaos not with force, but with ideas. Ideas that would shape not only their time, but the entire future of Chinese civilization. As the spring and autumn period unfolded, the land no longer moved to a single rhythm. Instead, it pulsed with competing ambitions, shifting alliances, and the constant tension between survival and dominance. The Zhou king still sat in Luoyang, still honored in ritual, still called the Son of Heaven, but his voice no longer commanded the world. It echoed, distant and ceremonial, while real decisions were made elsewhere. Across the plains, more than 100 states once existed. Over time, they began to disappear, absorbed, conquered, or erased by stronger neighbors. The map was changing, not through careful design, but through conflict. Armies marched, sometimes for defense, often for expansion. Campaigns were no longer rare events. They became part of the rhythm of life. And yet, even in war, traces of the old order remained. Noble warriors still rode into battle on chariots, their status displayed as much as their strength. Rituals were performed before campaigns, sacrifices, divinations, ceremonies meant to align human action with cosmic will. Opponents sometimes treated one another with a form of respect, bound by traditions that reached back to the early Zhou, but these traditions were weakening. War was becoming more practical, less ceremonial. Victory mattered more than honor. Strategy began to outweigh ritual, and slowly, the nature of conflict itself began to change. Among the rising powers, certain states began to dominate the landscape. The state of Qi in the east grew wealthy through trade and control of resources. Jin in the north became a military force, organized and formidable. Chu in the south expanded aggressively, bringing its own cultural influences into the Central Plains. Qin, far to the west, still relatively modest in these early stages, was quietly strengthening, building the foundations of something that would later transform everything. These states did not claim kingship. Instead, their rulers took on a different role. They became hegemons, leaders who claimed to protect the Zhou order while effectively controlling it. One of the earliest was Duke Huan of Qi, who formed alliances and led coalitions of states, presenting himself as a defender of stability in a fractured world. But this stability was fragile. Alliances shifted constantly. A partner today could become an enemy tomorrow. Trust was temporary. Power had to be maintained, not assumed. And as warfare intensified, so did the demands on society. Armies grew larger. More men were drawn from farms into military service. Agriculture had to become more efficient to support both population growth and the cost of war. It is in this period that iron tools began to spread more widely, stronger than bronze, more accessible, and capable of transforming productivity. Fields expanded. Forests were cleared. Irrigation improved. The land itself was being reshaped. Cities, too, began to grow. No longer just administrative centers, they became hubs of activity. Markets filled with goods, workshops producing tools and weapons, walls rising higher and stronger to protect against attack. Within these cities, a new class began to emerge. People who were not nobles, not farmers, but something different, skilled artisans, merchants, advisors, and among them, thinkers, because in a world where the old order was breaking, people began to search for answers. Why was there so much conflict? What had gone wrong? How could harmony be restored? These questions gave rise to one of the most remarkable periods in human intellectual history, an age where ideas flourished as rapidly as conflict. The most influential of these thinkers was Confucius, known in his time as Kongzi. Born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, he lived in a world that, to him, felt like it had lost its way. The rituals of the past were still performed, but their meaning had weakened. Rulers sought power, but not virtue. Society had structure, but not harmony. Confucius did not seek to invent something entirely new. Instead, he looked backward. He believed that the early Zhou had achieved a kind of moral balance, a society guided not just by power, but by virtue. His teachings focused on restoring that balance through principles that were both simple and profound. Run, humaneness, compassion, the ability to care for others, ritual propriety, the correct way of behaving, not as empty ceremony, but as a way to structure relationships and maintain harmony. For Confucius, a ruler should not lead through fear or force, but through example. If a ruler was virtuous, the people would follow naturally. Order would not need to be imposed. It would emerge. But Confucius was not alone. Around the same time, another voice offered a very different perspective. Laozi, associated with the ideas that would later form Taoism. Where Confucius emphasized structure and moral duty, Laozi spoke of something more subtle. The Tao, the way that a force underlying everything, natural, flowing, beyond rigid control. Laozi suggested that the more humans tried to impose order, the more they disrupted the natural balance. True harmony came not from force, but from alignment, from simplicity, from restraint, from allowing things to unfold as they should in a world of constant conflict. This was a radical idea. Not all thinkers agreed with either of them. Some argued that human nature was flawed, that people would not act morally without strict laws and harsh enforcement. These ideas would later develop into legalism, a philosophy that prioritized order through control, discipline, and clear consequences. What makes this period extraordinary is not just the conflict of states, but the conflict of ideas, different visions of how the world should work, different answers to the same question: how do you create order in chaos? And these ideas were not confined to scrolls or quiet discussions. They moved between states. Rulers invited scholars to their courts, seeking advice, strategies, solutions. Thinkers traveled, taught, debated, trying to influence the direction of a world that seemed to be slipping further into disorder. Meanwhile, the Zhou king remained, still present, still performing rituals, still representing the mandate of heaven. But now, more than ever, he was a symbol of a past that could not fully return. The real future was being shaped elsewhere, in the courts of powerful states, on the battlefields where armies clashed, and in the minds of thinkers trying to redefine what it meant to rule, to live, to exist in a world that no longer followed old certainties. The spring and autumn period was not just an age of decline, it was an age of transformation. Because from its instability came innovation. From its fragmentation came ideas that would outlast kingdoms. And as the centuries moved forward, the pace of change would only accelerate. The rules of war would break. The scale of conflict would grow, and the struggle for dominance would intensify beyond anything seen. Before, the world was not moving back toward unity, that it was moving toward something far more decisive, As the centuries passed, the fragile balance of the spring and autumn period finally gave way to something far more intense, far more decisive. By the 5th century BCE, the old order had all but dissolved, and what remained was a world defined not by ritual rivalry, but by relentless, calculated struggle. This was the beginning of the Warring States period. The name itself tells the truth of it. War was no longer occasional, it was constant. The many small states of earlier centuries had now been reduced to a handful of powerful contenders: Qi, Chu, Yin, Han, Zhou Wei, and Qin. Each of them was no longer just defending its borders. Each was preparing for something larger: domination, and eventually unification. The nature of warfare changed completely in this era. The old aristocratic style of battle, chariots, noble warriors, ritual conduct, began to disappear. In its place came mass armies, drawn from the population, trained, organized, and deployed on a scale never seen before. War became industrial. Infantry replaced chariot elites as the backbone of armies. Iron weapons spread widely, stronger, cheaper, more effective than bronze. Crossbows appeared, allowing soldiers to strike from a distance with deadly precision. Fortifications grew massive, with walls stretching across landscapes, protecting cities that had become strategic centers of power. Battles were no longer symbolic. They were devastating. Entire armies could be annihilated. States could vanish in a single campaign. Victory was not about prestige. It was about survival. To sustain this level of warfare, states had to transform internally. Governments became more centralized. Bureaucracies expanded. Land was reorganized. Farmers were registered, taxed, and mobilized. Merit began to replace noble birth in determining rank, especially in military and administrative roles that a capable soldier or official could rise through achievement. This was a fundamental shift. Power was becoming more efficient, more structured, more ruthless. Among all the states, one began to stand apart. Not at first in obvious dominance, but in discipline, organization, and long-term vision. The state of Qin, located in the far west, Qin had once been considered less refined than the central states. But its position, somewhat removed from constant eastern conflicts, allowed it to develop differently. It adopted reforms that reshaped its entire structure, especially under the influence of legalist thinkers. Legalism rejected the idea that people could be guided by virtue alone. It argued that clear laws, strict enforcement, and harsh penalties were the only reliable way to maintain order. In Qin, this philosophy was not just discussed, that it was implemented. Under reformers like Shang, the state reorganized society with precision. Land was redistributed to encourage productivity. Military service was strictly enforced. Rewards and punishments were applied uniformly, regardless of status. Even noble families could lose privilege if they failed to meet expectations. The result was a state unlike the others, efficient, disciplined, unforgiving. While other states struggled with internal rivalries and shifting alliances, Qin focused on strengthening itself from within. Meanwhile, the other major states continued their struggle. Qi remained wealthy and influential, but often politically unstable. Chu controlled vast territories in the south, rich in resources but difficult to manage. Zhou and Wei fought fiercely in the north and center, sometimes gaining ground, sometimes losing it. Han, smaller and more vulnerable, struggled to survive between stronger neighbors. Yin, in the northeast, remained somewhat distant but still part of the larger contest. All of them understood one thing: the balance could not last forever. Someone would win. The strategies used in this period became increasingly sophisticated. Diplomacy, espionage, alliances, betrayals, these were as important as armies. Thinkers and advisors moved between courts, offering plans, warning of dangers, shaping decisions. Among them was Sun Tzu, whose work, The Art of War, distilled the lessons of conflict into principles that would endure far beyond this era. He wrote of deception, of flexibility, of understanding both oneself and the enemy. His ideas reflected a world where victory depended not just on strength, but on intelligence. And yet, Even with all this strategy, the cost was immense. Fields were abandoned as men went to war. Cities were besieged and destroyed. Populations were displaced. The scale of suffering grew alongside the scale of ambition. This was no longer a world trying to preserve order. IT was a world trying to survive transformation. And through it all, the idea of the mandate of heaven still lingered. Every ruler believed or claimed that they held it. Every victory was seen as proof, every defeat as a sign of weakness. But the meaning of the mandate was shifting. It was no longer just about moral virtue. It was increasingly tied to results, to the ability to win, to control, to unify. Heaven, it seemed, favored strength to be why the late stages of the Warring States period, the outcome was becoming clearer. Qin, through its reforms and relentless focus, had built something unmatched. Its armies were disciplined. Its administration was efficient. Its leadership was decisive. One by one, the other states would face it. And one by one, they would fall. The long age of fragmentation, of competing powers and endless war was approaching its end, not through agreement, not through balance, but through conquest. And from that conquest, something entirely new would emerge, not just another dynasty, but the first true empire of China, that a unified state, a single ruler, that a system that would reshape the land in ways no one before had achieved. The world of many states was about to become one. As the final decades of the Warring States period unfolded, the long struggle between rival states narrowed toward a single, inevitable outcome. The balance had already shifted. The momentum was no longer shared. It was concentrated in the West. The state of Qin moved with a clarity and force that the others could not match. Its strength did not come from chance. It had been built carefully over generations through discipline, reform, and an uncompromising belief in structure. The legalist system that guided Qin had reshaped society into something precise and efficient. Farmers produced more. Soldiers fought harder. Officials were judged not by birth, but by performance. Everything served the state. And now, under a single ruler, that state was ready to expand beyond all limits. That ruler was Zhou, that he ascended the Qin throne as a young king. But he inherited more than a title. He inherited a machine of power already in motion. Guided by capable ministers and hardened by years of conflict, he began a series of campaigns that would change history. One by one, the rival states fell. Han was the first, weakened and vulnerable, unable to resist Qin's advance. Zhou followed after brutal campaigns that shattered its military strength. Wei, once powerful, was overcome through both siege and strategy. Chu, vast and resource-rich, resisted fiercely but ultimately collapsed under sustained assault. Yin and Qi, the last to stand, were defeated and turned out by 221 BCE. For the first time in history, the lands that we now recognize as China were unified under a single authority. And Zhou did something no ruler before him had done, that he did not call himself king. He created a new title, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor. It was not just a change of name. It was a declaration that a new era had begun. The age of competing states was over. The age of empire had begun, but unification was only the beginning. Holding such a vast territory together required more than victory. It required transformation of systems, of culture, of identity itself. Qin Shi Huang moved quickly, with the same relentless precision that had brought him power. That he standardized writing, ensuring that across the empire, officials could communicate in a common script. This was not a small change. It bound regions together in a shared administrative language, allowing governance to function across distance. That he standardized weights and measures so that trade, taxation, and production could operate consistently. He unified currency, making economic exchange more efficient and controlled. Roads were built, wide, straight, connecting distant regions to the imperial center. These were not just for trade, but for movement of armies, for control, for presence. Even the width of cart axles was standardized, so that roads would wear evenly. Everything was ordered. Everything was controlled. The old feudal system of the Zhou was dismantled. No longer would regional lords hold inherited power over their territories. Instead, the empire was divided into administrative regions governed by officials appointed by the emperor. Loyalty was no longer local, it was centralized, and this centralization was enforced with the full weight of legalist philosophy. Laws were strict, punishments were harsh. Order was maintained not through persuasion, but through certainty. To challenge the system was to risk everything. Yet alongside this control, there was vision. Qin Shi Huang understood that unification was not just political, it was physical. The northern borders of the empire faced constant threat from nomadic groups. To defend against them, existing walls built by earlier states were connected and expanded. This was the beginning of what would later become known as the Great Wall of China. Not the single continuous wall we imagine today, but a vast, evolving network of fortifications built with immense labor, stretching across landscapes, marking the boundary between empire and uncertainty, and beneath the ground. Another project was taking shape. The emperor prepared for death. Near his capital, a massive tomb complex was constructed, an entire underground world meant to mirror the empire above. At its heart lay his burial chamber, surrounded by thousands of life-size soldiers, the terracotta army, each figure unique, each armed, each standing in silent formation, ready to serve their emperor in the afterlife as they had in life. It was a statement of power that extended beyond death itself. But for all its achievements, the Qin Empire carried within it the same tension that had ended so many dynasties before it. Its strength was also its burden. The scale of its projects, roads, walls, tombs, required immense labor. Taxes were heavy. Conscription pulled men from farms into construction and military service. The strict laws, while effective, created fear and resentment. Order was maintained, but at a cost. Qin Shi Huang ruled with absolute authority, and for a time, it seemed unshakable. The land was unified. Systems were aligned. The vision of a single empire had been realized. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. When the emperor died in 210 BCE, far from the capital during a journey, the stability he had enforced began to weaken almost immediately. Court intrigue followed. Succession struggles emerged. The system, so dependent on strong central control, began to strain without its creator. And the people, long burdened by labor and law, began to resist. Rebellion sparked. What had been unified through force now faced the reality that force alone could not sustain it forever. The Qin dynasty, for all its power, would not last long, but its impact would endure. Because it had done something irreversible. It had taken a land of many states and made it one. It had created the concept of empire in China, and even as it fell, the idea it built would not disappear. Others would rise to take its place, not to undo what Qin had created, but to reshape it. Soften its harshness. Preserve its structure, and to carry forward the vision of a unified China into a new age. The empire created by Qin Shi Huang was unlike anything the land had ever seen. Unified, ordered, and absolute. But it was also fragile in a way that only became clear after his death in 210 BC. He had built a system that depended entirely on control, on strict laws, constant oversight, and the authority of a single ruler. Without that force at the center, the structure began to weaken almost immediately. His death was kept secret at first. Court officials feared instability, so they concealed the truth while they arranged succession. Through manipulation and intrigue, a younger son was placed on the throne, Qin Heir Shi, a ruler far less capable than his father and far more dependent on those around him. Power shifted behind the scenes. Corruption spread within the court. Decisions were made not for stability, but for control. Punishments remained harsh, but leadership grew uncertain. The system still functioned, but without direction. And beyond the palace, the empire was already straining. The people had endured years of heavy labor, building roads, extending the Great Wall of China, constructing palaces, and a vast tomb guarded by the terracotta army. Taxes were high. Laws were unforgiving. Even minor offenses could lead to severe punishment. Now, With the emperor gone and authority weakening, something long suppressed began to rise. That resistance. It started small. In 209 BCE, a group of conscripted soldiers, delayed on their journey due to heavy rain, faced execution under Qin law for failing to arrive on time. Instead of accepting death, they made a decision. They rebelled. This uprising, led by figures such as Shang, was not large at first, but it carried something powerful. It showed that the Qin system, for all its strength, could be challenged, and once that idea took hold, it spread. Across the empire, revolts broke out. Peasants, former soldiers, local leaders, many who had suffered under Qin rule, rose against the collapsing authority. The empire that had taken decades to build began to fracture in just a few years. Among those who rose during this chaos were two figures who would shape what came next. Point one was Xiang, a powerful aristocrat and brilliant military commander from the former state of Chu. The other was Liu Bang, a man of far humbler origins, a former minor official, familiar with the hardships of ordinary life. They were very different. Xiang was bold, strong, and decisive in battle. Liu Bang was more measured, more adaptable, more willing to listen and adjust as the Qin collapsed. These two emerged as leading contenders in the struggle to control what remained. By 206 BC, the Qin dynasty had fallen. Its palaces were burned. Its authority shattered. Its brief but powerful rule ended almost as quickly as it had begun. But the chaos did not end with Qin. Instead, it deepened. China, newly unified, did not return to its old fragmented state immediately. Instead, it entered a new phase of conflict, the struggle between Xiang and Liu Bang for control of the entire realm. This period, often called the Chu-Han contention, was not just a war of armies, but of approaches to leadership. Xiang relied on strength and dominance. Liu Bang relied on alliances, strategy, and the support of capable advisors. Over several years, battles were fought, territories gained and lost, and the balance shifted again and again. In the end, it was Liu Bang who prevailed. In 202 BCE, he declared himself emperor, founding a new dynasty, the Han Dynasty. And with that, a new chapter began. Where Qin had ruled with strict legalist control, Liu Bang chose a different path. He did not abandon the systems Qin had built, centralized administration, standardized systems, unified governance, but he softened them. Laws became less severe. Taxes were reduced. Forced labor was eased. The goal was not just control, but stability. Over time, the Han Dynasty developed a balance between structure and philosophy. While legalist methods remained in administration, the teachings of Confucius gained increasing influence. Confucian ideas emphasized moral leadership, proper relationships, and governance through virtue rather than fear. Under the Han, these ideas became central to how the state justified its rule. The emperor was still powerful, but now he was expected to be just care for the people, rule not only with authority, but with responsibility. This blending of systems, Qin structure and Confucian philosophy, created something far more durable than what came before. The Han Dynasty would last for over 4 centuries. During this time, China expanded its territory, strengthened its economy, and developed systems of governance that would influence future dynasties for thousands of years. Trade routes opened, including what would later be known as the Silk Road, connecting China to distant regions. Culture flourished. Writing, history, science, and philosophy all advanced. The very identity of being Han would become so central that even today, the majority ethnic group in China carries that name. What Qin had started, Han made sustainable. The idea of a unified empire did not fade after Qin. It became the expectation. Dynasties would rise and fall, but the concept of one China, governed under a central authority, guided by both structure and moral philosophy, would endure. And yet, even as stability returned under the Han, the patterns of history remained. Power would grow. Challenges would emerge. Balance would shift again. Because the story of China, from its earliest villages to its greatest empires, has never been a straight line. It is a cycle of rise and fall, of order and chaos. of destruction and renewal. And as the Han Dynasty continued to expand and evolve, new forces, internal and external, would begin to test that balance once more. With Liu Bang's victory and the founding of the Han Dynasty in 202 BCE, the era of rebuilding began. Yet the land was still scarred by decades of conflict. The once glorious Qin infrastructure had survived, but the people were weary, the economy strained, and local loyalties fractured. Liu Bang, now Emperor Gaozu of Han, understood that survival of the dynasty required more than military dominance. It demanded reconciliation, that he moved swiftly. Amnesties were declared for rebels who had fought under Xiang or other leaders, turning former enemies into allies. Land reforms and tax adjustments eased the burdens on peasants, restoring faith in the government. Central authority was maintained, but local governors were chosen carefully, often from families with proven loyalty rather than sheer wealth or birthright. The genius of the early Han lay in balance. Unlike the Qin, whose rule relied entirely on fear, the Han combined authority with legitimacy. People were still expected to obey, but the promise of fairness, stability, and opportunity made the system resilient. Over time, administration became more sophisticated. Confucian scholars were gradually integrated into the bureaucracy, guiding policies and ethical standards. Record-keeping and standardization, pioneered by Qin, continued, ensuring continuity across provinces. Infrastructure projects, roads, canals, and fortifications were expanded, supporting trade and military mobility. Military power remained essential, but diplomacy became equally important. The Han engaged in strategic alliances with neighboring tribes and states, using marriage, tribute, and trade to secure borders without constant warfare. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Han had transformed from a fragile post-Qin regime into a stable, culturally cohesive empire. Its governance model, centralized yet flexible, legalist in method, Confucian in morality, set a template that would influence China for centuries. Culturally, the dynasty sparked a renaissance. Historiography flourished, with figures like Sima Qian compiling records that preserved knowledge for generations. Technological advancements in metallurgy, agriculture, and astronomy improved daily life. Trade networks expanded, connecting the empire to Central Asia and beyond, laying early foundations for the Silk Road. Yet even as the Han consolidated, subtle tensions lingered. Powerful families and provinces sometimes challenged imperial authority. Eunuchs and court factions could manipulate emperors. And beyond the borders, nomadic confederations threatened to destabilize the frontier. Still, the dynasty endured because it learned the lessons of Qin's failure. Harsh, absolute control without legitimacy breeds rebellion. Centralized power must be paired with moral governance. Stability requires both military strength and societal trust. Through these principles, the Han Dynasty cemented its place in history, not merely as a continuation of empire, but as the crucible in which the identity of China was forged by the end of the 2nd century BCE. What emerged was more than an empire. It was a civilization with enduring institutions, cultural cohesion, and a blueprint for governance that future dynasties would emulate. The story of Qin and Han shows a pattern repeated throughout history. Extreme ambition can create great power, but only balance and adaptation create lasting legacy. From the iron grip of Qin Shi Huang to the enduring structure of the Han, China learned that true strength lies not just in conquest, but in the careful weaving of authority, philosophy, and the consent of the governed. History had taught a lesson that would echo for millennia. Empires may rise by force, but they endure through wisdom. After decades of consolidation, the Han Dynasty entered a period historians would later call its Golden Age. This was a time when political stability, economic growth, and cultural achievement converged, creating an era that would define what it meant to be Chinese for centuries. Military expansion and border security. While the early Han focused on rebuilding, the next generations turned outward. Emperor Wu of Han, ruling from 141 to 87 BCE, was particularly ambitious. Under his leadership, Northern campaigns against the Xiongnu secured the northern frontier. These nomadic confederations had long threatened China's borders, raiding villages and disrupting trade. The Han army, equipped with iron weapons, disciplined formations, and innovative tactics, pushed them back and forced tributary treaties that stabilized the region. Southern and western expansion extended control into what is now Vietnam, parts of modern Central Asia, and along strategic trade routes. This brought new resources, including spices, horses, and precious metals, directly into Han markets. Fortifications and garrisons were built along the frontier, linking military control with roads and canals to allow rapid troop movements. These campaigns weren't just about conquest. They were strategic moves to ensure the empire could thrive economically and culturally without constant fear of invasion. The Silk Road. Trade and cultural exchange. One of the most enduring legacies of the Han was the creation of the Silk Road network. Traders, diplomats, and envoys traveled thousands of miles, connecting China with Central Asia, India, the Middle East, and even Rome. This was not just commerce. It was the flow of ideas, technology, and culture. Silk and textiles became China's most valuable export, coveted from the steppes of Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Paper and ironworking techniques, along with agricultural innovations, slowly spread westward. Buddhism and other philosophical ideas began to enter China, setting the stage for religious and cultural transformation centuries later. The Silk Road also fostered domestic prosperity. Cities along trade routes, like Chang'an, modern Xi'an, the Han capital, flourished as hubs of commerce, crafts, and scholarship. Merchants, scholars, and artisans thrived in this cosmopolitan environment, creating a fusion of cultures that enriched Han society. Cultural flourishing and intellectual achievement. The Golden Age was not only about wealth and territory. It was a period of extraordinary intellectual and cultural growth. Historiography and philosophy. Sima Qian compiled the records of the Grand Historian, a monumental chronicle of Chinese history that set the standard for scholarship. Confucianism, which had begun to inform bureaucratic policy under Emperor Wu, became the ethical and educational foundation of governance. Science and technology. Han scholars innovated in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and engineering. They developed the water-powered armillary sphere to track stars, improved seismographs to detect earthquakes, and refined iron casting techniques. Art and literature, sculpture, painting, and poetry flourished. Tombs of the elite were adorned with intricate carvings and murals, while court-sponsored poetry celebrated the empire's triumphs and natural beauty. Music and dance were formalized as part of court ritual, blending entertainment with moral and political instruction. Society and daily life for ordinary citizens improved as well. Agricultural advances, like the widespread use of the heavy plow and irrigation systems, increased yields. Markets and fairs connected rural communities with urban centers, and artisans' guilds encouraged innovation. While social hierarchy remained strict, the Han administration offered avenues for merit-based advancement, especially through civil service examinations that selected officials based on ability rather than solely on birth. Challenges beneath the golden surface. Despite its accomplishments, the Han Empire faced underlying tensions. Court politics could be deadly, with factions, eunuchs, and ambitious officials manipulating succession. Regional governors and powerful landowners sometimes amassed private armies, threatening central authority. Frontier pressures from nomadic tribes persisted, requiring constant vigilance and diplomacy. Natural disasters such as floods and droughts occasionally undermined harvests, provoking local unrest. Yet these challenges did not destroy the dynasty. They tested its resilience. The Han government adapted, balancing military might with diplomacy, central authority with local administration, and Confucian ideals with practical governance. Legacy of the Golden Age. By the 1st century CE, the Han Dynasty had achieved a remarkable synthesis. It had unified China politically, expanded its territory, secured its borders, and created a thriving economy. Its culture and institutions were so influential that even later dynasties, Tang, Song, Ming, and beyond, look back to the Han as a model of governance, scholarship, and cultural achievement. The story of the Han's Golden Age illustrates a profound truth about history. Empires endure not merely through conquest, but through a combination of strategy, administration, innovation, and the integration of culture and knowledge. Where the Qin had ruled with fear, the Han ruled with vision, ensuring that China would remain a coherent civilization long after emperors had passed. The legacy of the Han is visible even today in language, government structures, philosophy, and the very idea of a unified Chinese identity. From the dust of war to the heights of culture, the Han Dynasty proved that lasting greatness requires more than strength. It requires wisdom, vision, and the ability to adapt to both challenges and opportunities. That'd be why the late 2nd century CE, cracks began to appear in the golden age of the Han Dynasty. Generations of prosperity had created wealth, culture, and a sense of order, but the very success of the empire also sowed the seeds of instability. Court intrigue and eunuch power as emperors aged or ascended the throne as children, real power often fell into the hands of palace eunuchs and imperial consorts. These court factions frequently battled for influence, manipulating succession and controlling appointments. Their struggles eroded the authority of the emperor and created a climate of suspicion and violence in the capital. Land concentration and peasant unrest meanwhile. Economic inequality worsened. Wealthy landowners accumulated vast estates, sometimes exempt from taxation, while small farmers struggled to survive. Natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, worsened the hardships, and many peasants were forced to sell themselves or their families into servitude to survive. These tensions erupted in large-scale uprisings, the most famous being the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE, a peasant revolt inspired by religious and utopian ideas promising a new era of equality and justice. The fragmentation of power regional governors and military generals, initially loyal to the Han, began to act autonomously. They commanded private armies, collected taxes independently, and sometimes ignored imperial edicts entirely. This decentralization weakened central authority, turning the empire into a patchwork of semi-independent regions. War and the fall of the Han Civil War became inevitable. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, though eventually suppressed, had drained the empire's resources and exposed the fragility of its governance. Ambitious generals and warlords seized the opportunity, carving out territories for themselves and fighting each other for supremacy. By 220 CE, the last Han emperor was forced to abdicate, ending 4 centuries of imperial rule. The dawn of the 3 kingdoms. From the ashes of the Han rose 3 dominant powers. Chao Wei, founded in northern China by Chao Pai, who claimed imperial authority. Shu Han, in the southwest, led by Liu Bei, a distant member of the Han royal family who sought to restore the dynasty's legitimacy. Eastern Wu, in the southeast, under the leadership of Sun Quan, controlling the rich Yangtze River basin. These 3 states were locked in a bitter and prolonged struggle for supremacy, a period immortalized in literature and legend as the 3 Kingdoms era. It became synonymous with heroism, strategy, and political intrigue. Figures like Zhuge Liang, Cao Cao, and Sun Tzu became emblematic of cunning, loyalty, and ambition. Battles, alliances, betrayals, and heroic sacrifices marked this turbulent period, shaping Chinese cultural memory for centuries. Legacy of the Han's fall, though the Han Dynasty ended, its influence persisted. The administrative systems, Confucian principles, and cultural identity it had established continued to guide subsequent states. The chaos of the 3 kingdoms demonstrated both the dangers of centralized weakness and the enduring strength of the institutions and culture the Han had built. The story of the Han's decline is a lesson in the fragility of even the greatest empires. Prosperity can mask vulnerability, and internal divisions can be more deadly than external threats. Yet it also sets the stage for one of the most legendary eras in Chinese history, where heroes and villains, generals and strategists would define the destiny of the land for generations. With the Han Dynasty gone, China fractured into the 3 kingdoms, each vying for dominance in a landscape of shifting alliances ruthless ambition, and relentless warfare. This era became as much a battle of minds as of armies, where strategy, deception, and loyalty were tested in equal measure. Cao Cao, the northern strategist in the north, Cao Cao consolidated power with unmatched political acumen. He absorbed smaller warlords, reformed taxation and the military, and cultivated a reputation for both ruthlessness and efficiency. Cao Cao's armies were disciplined, and he mastered psychological warfare, intimidating enemies before a sword was drawn. His victory at the Battle of Guandu, 200 CE, over Yuan Shao, a numerically superior rival, is still celebrated as a masterclass in strategy, dividing an enemy internally, striking decisively, and exploiting logistics. Liu Bei and the Shu Han cause in the southwest. Liu Bei, a distant relative of the Han royal family, became the symbol of legitimacy. While his resources were limited, Liu Bei relied on charisma, alliances, and the counsel of his brilliant strategist Zhuge Liang, whose ingenuity became legendary. Zhuge Liang's use of diplomacy, spies, and inventive battlefield tactics, such as the empty fort strategy, turned disadvantage into opportunity and cemented the mythic aura of Shu Han's leadership. Sun Quan and the Eastern Wu Dynasty to the southeast. Sun Quan controlled the fertile Yangtze River basin. His mastery of naval warfare and river defenses made his kingdom a difficult target. The Battle of Red Cliffs, 208 to 209 CE, showcased the unity of Sun Quan and Liu Bei against Cao Cao's massive forces. By using fire ships, careful terrain planning, and timing, the smaller allied armies annihilated Cao Cao's fleet, halting his southern advance and shaping the future balance of power. Alliances, betrayals, and the human drama that the Three Kingdoms era was defined not only by battles, but by political intrigue. Generals switched sides, spies sowed confusion, and loyalty was constantly tested. The period saw heroic figures rise, like Guan Yu, the god of war, known for loyalty and martial prowess, and cunning tacticians like Sima Yi, whose patience and subtle manipulation would eventually lead to the end of Cao Wei. Every decision carried immense weight. A misstep could mean the fall of a city, the destruction of an army, or the loss of life for thousands. Culture amid chaos, even in constant warfare, culture flourished. Poetry, philosophy, and historical recording thrived, preserving the tales of heroes and the lessons of leadership for posterity. The romance of the Three Kingdoms, centuries later, would immortalize these events, blending history with legend to create archetypes of heroism, strategy, and tragedy. The fragile balance of power over decades, the Three Kingdoms shifted in strength. Shu Han often struggled with resources, Eastern Wu relied on defensive mastery, and Cao Wei's internal politics and capable generals maintained northern dominance. The era demonstrated how geography, leadership, innovation, and human will could shape history. Every alliance formed, every battle fought, and every strategy executed reflected not just military might, but intellect, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. This period, though brutal and fragmented, became a mirror of human ambition, resilience, and ingenuity. It was a crucible in which legends were forged, teaching that even in chaos, vision, strategy, and loyalty could define the fate of nations. Decades of war had carved China into fractured lands, each kingdom bearing the scars of countless battles, the weight of political intrigue, and the exhaustion of its people. The Three Kingdoms, Cao Wei in the north, Shu Han in the southwest, and Eastern Wu in the southeast, had endured centuries of shifting power, heroic victories, and tragic defeats, but no dynasty, no matter how strong, could resist the relentless tide of internal decay and ambition. Shu Han's struggle and false Shu Han, under the rule of Liu Bei and later his son Liu Shan, had always been a kingdom of ideals, legitimacy, and strategic brilliance. Zhuge Liang's death marked the end of an era. Without his intellect guiding the state, Shu Han faced increasing pressure from its neighbors. Logistics became a nightmare. Its limited fertile land, mountainous terrain, and reliance on long supply lines from the Yangtze River made sustained defense difficult. Military campaigns continued under Zhou Liang's successors, yet repeated offensives against Chao Wei drained both manpower and morale. By 263 CE, Shu Han faced a relentless campaign by Sima Zhao, a master tactician and political schemer from the north. The final invasion saw Shu Han's capital, Chengdu, fall with minimal resistance. Its surrender signaling not just the end of a kingdom, but the collapse of the ideals that had sustained it. The end was mourned by many. Legends like Guan Yu and Zhuge Liang became symbols of loyalty, ingenuity, and moral integrity, remembered long after their land had fallen to conquerors. Eastern Wu's last stand to the southeast, Eastern Wu had survived through skillful diplomacy, naval dominance, and the fertile Yangtze River defenses. Sun Quan's heirs struggled to maintain the delicate balance between internal politics and external threats. Generals and ministers, once united by loyalty, now jockeyed for power, creating internal fractures that weakened the kingdom from within to by the late 260 CE, with Chao Wei absorbing Shu Han and consolidating power. Wu became the final independent bastion of the three kingdoms. Yet the northern campaigns by the descendants of Sima, a family that had mastered patience, manipulation, and timing, proved unstoppable. In 280 CE, Wu surrendered to the forces of Sima Yan, who declared himself the emperor of the unified Jin dynasty, ending the centuries-long saga of division, heroism, and tragedy. The Jin dynasty and unification, the Jin dynasty, emerging from the ashes of Chao Wei, brought a fragile unification to China. It marked the end of a legendary era where generals became heroes and statesmen turned the tide of war with intellect as much as force. Sima Yan's rule represented both the promise of stability and the seeds of future turbulence. Unification achieved through conquest and political maneuvering was never absolute peace. Under Jin, there were attempts to rebuild infrastructure, restore economic stability, and reconcile a population worn down by decades of war. Yet the scars of the Three Kingdoms era were deep. Population displacement, destroyed farmland, and lingering resentment from conquered regions made governance a delicate art. Jin's rulers had to balance power carefully among former rival generals, local elites, and bureaucrats while projecting the image of legitimacy and continuity. Legacy of the Three Kingdoms. Despite the eventual unification, the Three Kingdoms era left an indelible mark on Chinese history. It became a template for the study of strategy, politics, and human nature. Every ruler, general, and strategist from that period embodied lessons that transcended time. Courage and loyalty could inspire armies. Cunning and patience could outmaneuver stronger foes. Misjudgment or internal discord could undo even the most formidable power. Culturally, the period produced stories that would echo through centuries. Poetry, historical records, and legends immortalized figures like Zhuge Liang, Guan Yu, Zhou Yu, and Sima Yi, ensuring that the heroism, brilliance, and tragedy of the era would inspire generations. The romance of the Three Kingdoms, written centuries later, would blend history with myth, transforming warlords into archetypes of virtue, ambition, and cunning, while battles became moral and strategic parables. The unification under Jin was more than political. It was a philosophical and cultural closure to an age of chaos. The era had tested the resilience of humanity, how people responded to power, adversity, and ambition. It proved that history is shaped as much by ideas and choices as by armies and geography. In this crucible, heroes were made, legends born, and the foundation for future dynasties laid. The Three Kingdoms were gone, but their stories, strategies, and lessons would remain eternal, etched into the consciousness of a nation that had survived endless war and emerged with its identity, culture, and history intact. The fall of Eastern Wu and the rise of the Jin dynasty marked the official unification of China under a single imperial banner. But history rarely moves in neat, clean lines. The lands that had endured decades of relentless warfare, shifting allegiances, and uncountable lives lost now faced a new reality. Peace, but not simplicity. order, but not without tension. The people, scarred by the endless campaigns of the three kingdoms, carried the memories of destruction in their homes, fields, and collective psyche. Cities had been razed and rebuilt, rivers redirected or fortified, trade disrupted and restarted, traditions maintained even as they adapted. The Jin dynasty sought to consolidate authority over a vast and weary land, inheriting not only the territories of the three former kingdoms, but also the burdens of their internal divisions. The northern heartlands, once under Zhou Wei's strict military control, demanded governance that balanced force with administration. In Shu Han's southwestern lands, fertile valleys and strategic mountain passes required careful oversight, and the population there had grown accustomed to Zhou Yang's era of intellect and moral guidance. Now, under Jin, pragmatism often replaced idealism. Eastern Wu's former citizens, especially in Jiangdong, had long prided themselves on naval power and independent thinking. Integration into a northern-centric dynasty was met with both compliance and quiet resentment. Yet the unification brought innovations as well. Roads, canals, and trade networks began to stitch the fragmented lands together. Military garrisons were replaced, in part, by administrative offices and local magistrates who governed daily life rather than commanding armies. Jin emperors understood that legitimacy could not rely solely on conquest. It required culture, ceremony, and the symbolic authority of Confucian order. Temples, academies, and civil institutions were emphasized, reminding people that the dynasty was not just a military power, but a continuation of a civilizational tradition. Despite this consolidation, the legacy of the Three Kingdoms era remained vivid. Generals and strategists were studied, not just for their battlefield tactics, but for the wisdom of governance, alliance-making, and the understanding of human nature under stress. The tales of Guan Yu's loyalty, Zhou Yu's cunning, Zhuge Liang's intellect, and Sima Yi's patience became the backbone of military and philosophical education. They became parables of leadership, courage tempered with foresight, ambition tempered with strategy, loyalty tempered with pragmatism. These lessons transcended the Jin dynasty itself, influencing the political philosophy of future dynasties like the Tang and Song. The human cost of the era was immense. Tens of millions had perished in war, famine, or disease exacerbated by the collapse of civil structures. Yet, from this destruction arose resilience. Families migrated, rebuilt villages, and nurtured the land back to productivity. Artisans, scholars, and poets preserved cultural memory through writing, painting, and oral tradition. Legends became literature, and literature became moral instruction, binding the nation together even as memories of division lingered. Culturally, the Three Kingdoms era became a prism through which subsequent generations viewed virtue, loyalty, strategy, and ambition. The romance of the Three Kingdoms, written hundreds of years later, would not merely recount events. It would immortalize them, blending history with myth in a narrative that emphasized moral and strategic truths over mere chronology. Readers could see the human choices behind every battle, how trust and betrayal, courage and misjudgment shaped the course of nations. It was this timeless human element, the interplay of ambition, intellect, and morality, that made the era eternally compelling. Politically, the Jin dynasty's unification was fragile. While it brought the illusion of stability, cracks in administration, succession disputes, and pressures from nomadic tribes along the northern borders foreshadowed the cyclical turbulence of Chinese dynastic history. The short-lived Jin rule was soon challenged by internal rebellions and external invasions, reminding everyone that the end of the Three Kingdoms was not the end of struggle. It was merely a transformation of it. Yet even in this transience, the memory of the Three Kingdoms persisted. It became a lens through which leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike interpreted their present and imagined their future. Beyond politics and warfare, the era left a profound imprint on identity and morality. Concepts of loyalty, righteousness, ingenuity, and perseverance were no longer abstract virtues. They were tested in the crucible of fire and steel. Families taught children about heroes who faced impossible odds, generals who strategized with intellect as much as courage, and ministers who advised with integrity even when surrounded by deceit. These lessons shaped culture, not just strategy. They informed art, literature, philosophy, and the ethics of leadership for centuries. The rivers, mountains, and cities that bore witness to the campaigns of Liu Bei, Cao Cao, Sun Quan, and their descendants became silent historians. Every battlefield, whether remembered or forgotten, held stories of heroism and tragedy. Even centuries later, scholars and travelers would visit sites like the plains of Red Cliffs, Chengdu, or the banks of the Yangtze, imagining the roar of armies, the crackle of fire, and the decisions that shaped empires. These landscapes became living testaments to the era, teaching that history is not only in books, but inscribed in the earth itself. Ultimately, the Three Kingdoms period was more than a sequence of wars and political maneuvers. It was a mirror of human ambition and frailty, intelligence and folly. It demonstrated that power is fleeting, that decisions echo far beyond their immediate consequences, and that the intertwining of morality, strategy, and chance can shape the destiny of nations. Even as dynasties rose and fell, the stories of this era endured, providing guidance, inspiration, and caution to all who came after. In the end, the Three Kingdoms were gone, yet their spirit remained eternal. The lessons of loyalty, wisdom, courage, and strategy transcended time, etched into the consciousness of a civilization that had endured fragmentation, chaos, and renewal. Every scholar who studied them, every artist who depicted them, and every leader who reflected on their strategies ensured that the echoes of the Three Kingdoms would never fade. From the ashes of war, a new unity was forged, not only of land, but of memory, culture, and human understanding. The story of these kingdoms had ended, yet its legacy became immortal, a testament to the enduring interplay of power, principle, and human will. The age of division had passed, but the lessons of strategy, morality, and human nature had produced would resonate for centuries, shaping China's history, literature, and philosophy long after the last emperor of Jin had vanished from the throne. The Three Kingdoms lived on, not in borders, armies, or decrees, but in the hearts, minds, and stories of those who remembered, studied, and revered them.